Hello, my name is Alexandra Cernat, and this is the 3I Framework, Considerations for Developing Regulations for Direct-to-Consumer Genetic Testing in Canada. Direct-to-consumer tests are DNA tests marketed or sold directly to individuals by commercial companies, rather than being offered through traditional healthcare pathways. Most companies, like 23andMe, are based in the United States and offer online purchasing of testing for both health and non-health related traits. In this presentation, we're only concerned with testing for health-related traits. There exists a bit of controversy around DTC genetic testing. Proponents assert that this type of testing facilitates greater consumer autonomy, mobilizes people to make positive lifestyle changes, and that individuals have a right to their genetic information. On the other hand, critics are concerned that consumers receive inadequate pre- and post-test counseling. They argue that commercial companies may not be able to safeguard consumer privacy, and that the accuracy and clinical validity and utility of many of these tests is unknown. DTC genetic testing currently exists largely outside of any regulatory schemes, and countries have taken varying approaches to regulation. In some places, DTC genetic testing is essentially banned, but in others, there's no legislation about genetic testing at all, let alone DTC genetic testing. In Canada, there are no regulations around DTC genetic testing. This is a problem because tests that do not meet regulatory requirements in their country of origin may be available here in Canada. And again, most of these tests originate in the United States, where the Food and Drug Administration has set out some requirements around accuracy, clinical, and analytic validity. We intend to fill this gap by using the 3I framework for policy analysis. This framework was first described in 1994, and it's been used to analyze the development of social policies as well as some healthcare policies. The 3 I's in this framework are the ideas, interests, and institutions that form the 3 main explanatory variables of any policy. Their analysis helps us understand why a policy was created in a particular manner, or why enacting change may be more or less challenging. Therefore, the purpose of our study is to use the 3I framework to identify and analyze the considerations around regulation of DTC genetic testing in Canada. We performed a scoping review of literature and legislation to determine the current regulatory landscape around DTC genetic testing in Canada. We were interested in published scientific literature, as well as documents or reports from the government or professional organizations dealing with the ethical, social, and legal implications of DTC genetic testing, consumer or healthcare provider perspectives on, preferences for, or experiences with DTC genetic testing, or the effect of such testing on the healthcare system. We performed data analysis through a staged coding process, similar to grounded theory. Findings from multiple articles were separated into conceptual components, summarized, and regrouped based on their thematic relationships. The 3I framework was then used to group the identified themes together as ideas, interests, or institutions. Ultimately, 92 publications, organizational reports, and governmental documents were captured in analysis. In the included works, we identified 4 ideas, the interests of 2 stakeholders, and the functions of 2 institutions that play a role in the regulatory landscape surrounding DTC genetic testing. And you can see them all here. So for ideas, we have autonomy, informed consent, privacy, and clinical validity or accuracy. For interests, we have members of the public and healthcare providers. And for institutions, we have Health Canada and the Genetic Non-Discrimination Act. So, ideas. The first is autonomy, which is understood as individual independence. Although DTC genetic tests may enhance consumer autonomy by letting them choose whether to undergo testing, the discussion around autonomy is more often centered around this question in blue. Do these tests empower consumers to take control of their health? Proponents argue that they do, by providing consumers with information that can inform positive lifestyle changes. And in general, consumers intend to modify their diet and exercise based on their genetic profiles. However, what we typically see is either no change or only a small change in actual health behavior in response to DTC genetic testing results. So, while opting to undergo DTC genetic testing certainly constitutes exercising one's autonomy, the ability of these tests to increase consumer autonomy post-testing is debatable. Respect for autonomy is operationalized through the process of informed consent, which is our second idea. As I mentioned before, one of the main concerns around this type of testing is that consumers are not given adequate information prior to testing, and as a result, they might receive information they weren't expecting, weren't prepared for, or that they didn't even actually want. And what studies have found is actually many consumers undergo testing without knowing what to expect. Information on company websites is incomplete or misleading, and often DTC genetic testing websites make no mention of the risks associated with testing. More than that, when we look at consumer understanding of DTC genetic tests, we find that most feel like they have a good understanding of their results, but they still struggle with complex concepts like reduced penetrance. So this brings us to our third idea, which is privacy. The sustainability of consumer privacy is a common concern, particularly when it comes to keeping an individual's genetic information confidential from insurance companies and employers. And there's a really big question around this. More than half of DTC genetic testing websites examined in one study didn't have any privacy policy at all. And when companies do have privacy policies, they often warn consumers that third parties might have access to their information. The last idea we'll discuss is the clinical validity and utility, essentially the accuracy of DTC genetic tests, which has been questioned by many authors. DTC tests are based on analysis of single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, SNPs, and the questions that come up around clinical validity and utility stem largely from the low predictive ability of disease based on the association of a particular SNP with a given disease. In fact, different companies might assess the exact same SNP as high risk or low risk for a particular disease, just depending on the company. And there have also been discrepancies between DTC genetic testing results and subsequent clinical confirmatory testing. Regulation might mandate some standard for accuracy and could help address some of these concerns. Next, we'll address the interests of two stakeholders, the public and healthcare providers. We acknowledge that the interests of DTC genetic testing providers are also relevant, but they weren't included in analysis due to a lack of studies reporting their concerns. So, the public. Most who've undergone testing are supportive of the current model of access. They feel that individuals have a right to their genetic information, and some believe that tests should be available even more widely, like in drugstores. That said, most of the American public does believe that some sort of non-governmental organization should provide some oversight for these tests. When we look to other places, such as Australia and Germany, we see that these publics do not trust commercial companies very much at all when it comes to privacy and counseling. Healthcare providers also have mixed perspectives about DTC genetic testing. Some think it could be helpful in some situations, but others believe that genetic testing without clinician involvement would be completely unacceptable. In any case, though, most providers do not feel prepared to answer patients' questions about this type of testing. We've now arrived at the final piece of our analysis: institutions. The first one I'll talk about is Health Canada. So in Canada, Health Canada regulates medical devices, pharmaceuticals, and diagnostics to ensure their safety, effectiveness, and quality prior to authorizing them for sale. Health Canada does not impose regulations on DTC genetic testing, and that's because the DNA that Canadian consumers submit is analyzed outside of the country. So the DNA collection kits are considered low-risk devices that only transport DNA. If, however, samples were tested within Canada, it's possible Health Canada might consider increasing regulatory oversight. Lastly, the Genetic Non-Discrimination Act. This was passed into law in 2017, and I do believe that there is something similar in the United States. Essentially, this law prohibits anyone from requiring you to undergo genetic testing or share any of your genetic information, and it prohibits the use of any genetic information in a discriminatory way. So while DTC genetic tests themselves are not regulated here, there are legal protections in place around the dissemination and use of their results. So we've now talked about 4 ideas, the interests of 2 stakeholders, and 2 institutions that are relevant to policy development around DTC genetic testing. What we saw is that DTC genetic tests facilitate autonomy by providing the opportunity to test. But if consumers don't act upon the information they receive, does that information still enable them to make life-shaping choices? And even if the answer is no, is that a sufficiently strong argument in favor of regulation? Especially when consumers have different understandings of value, and interest in monitoring or improving health isn't always the primary reason for testing. Some do it for entertainment or curiosity, in which case the generated information does serve its intended purpose. Regardless of how consumers use or do not use their genetic information, involving knowledgeable healthcare providers in the testing process might help alleviate concerns around informed decision-making, as well as increased anxiety or distress following receipt of results. But if we're to mandate clinician involvement, it's important to recognize that increased genetics education for healthcare providers is likely necessary. We can look to other countries to learn from them in terms of what works and what doesn't for regulation. So for example, there are many European countries that have said, for health-related genetic testing, medical supervision is mandatory. But the challenge with DTC genetic tests is that they're online. So even if we could place restrictions on the offer of testing from Canadian territory, it might be hard to restrict access to tests from abroad. One of the strengths of this review is that we had a broad search strategy, which enabled the retrieval of a large number of pertinent articles and reports, therefore providing a larger evidence base through which the ideas, interests, and institutions related to DTC genetic testing regulation in Canada could be identified and analyzed. However, a main limitation is that while we identified all of these ideas, interests, and institutions, we were not able to determine where the balance lies between the benefits and risk or harms of health-related DTC genetic testing. So this was the first study to address policy gaps in DTC genetic testing from the Canadian perspective. And as such, it is a resource to gain a foundational understanding of the ethical, social, technical, and legal issues around regulation of DTC genetic testing in Canada. What we ultimately conclude is that regulations around health-related DTC genetic testing should require an assessment of the clinical validity of tests before they become publicly available, control how these tests are marketed, and dictate requirements for healthcare provider involvement. Finally, we would like to acknowledge support and funding sources. Thank you.